This tells us a story of dual use, how to look at energy as a potential form of abundance, but also how we've developed military capabilities and destructive capabilities on the back of a new form of access to energy, a new form of science, a new form of technological development. So it takes the story essentially from a story of agriculture, organization in terms of hierarchy, to a story of expansion, security dilemmas between a number of countries that had repercussions, terrible repercussions on other societies in the world and on the biosphere. Then there was the history of the Industrial Revolution, which is the third step that they talk about, which is a great acceleration, a systematization essentially of a number of different sort of, things, sort of extractive and productive means that were systematized across different regions, which we've seen obviously an acceleration with globalization as well. And then the last step that they talk about is the sort of nuclear age, which tells a story of energy turned technology, technology turned into new means of violence. And now we're shifting energy systems. We're opening up the chapter of AI, which some people are saying it's going to, enhance productivity. It's going to optimize humans. And then, some people like, I think it's Suleiman, who is part of the people who created AI, is telling us it's the biggest danger to humanity ever. And indeed, the particularity essentially of all of these different moments is that innovations always came as a result of certain types of logic, and they made perfect sense at the time.
Welcome to Entangled World, where we explore our interrelated existential, social, economic, ecological, and technological challenges, their underlying drivers, and how a more beautiful world might emerge. I'm your host, Najia Shaukat Lepson. I'm a daughter of Pakistani Muslim immigrants, a mom, and an intersystems thinker. Join me on a journey to discover what is uniquely and meaningfully ours to do at this pivotal moment in time in service to the sacredness of life. My guest today is Olivia Lazard. Olivia is a research fellow at Carnegie Europe, where her research involves investigating how to support a move towards regenerative foreign and security policy within the European Union. She also leads projects at the University of Exeter on the ecological costs of the energy transition. Essentially, Olivia works on the geopolitics of climate-disrupted futures and ecological breakdown. With a background in conflict resolution and deep field experience in some of the world's most fragile contexts, she now focuses on preventing and mitigating the risks associated with a global competition over specific renewable and non-renewable resources. Her work tackles the decarbonisation-regeneration nexus, the core pillar for the future of global security and peace. In this conversation, Olivia and I discuss the major blind spots of the energy transition and how competitive resource extraction is likely to lead to conflict, violence, ecological destabilization, and the dangerous potential of simultaneously compromising multiple major ecosystems for the sake of resource extraction. She describes how COVID and the Ukraine war revealed some important vulnerabilities in our interconnected systems and how resources can be powerfully weaponized by those who control them. She puts the Ukraine-Russia conflict in context as part of a larger story that has major implications for the future, a possible future in which Russia may be able to use its control over energy, critical minerals, agriculture, and other natural resources to threaten the stability of other increasingly dependent, destabilized nations. We also talk about how China has perfected the verticalization of supply chains for several critical minerals needed for the advanced tech revolution, particularly the development of AI. China is not only an industrial heavyweight leading in manufacturing, but has also become a technological heavyweight, which has massive geopolitical implications for the global balance of power. We also discuss the history of industrial revolutions and their relationship to human conflict, with a particular eye to what history's lessons may portend for the industrial and technological shifts that are now underway. We discuss historical cycles of attempts to control, extract, expand, and conquer, and the resulting long-term consequences. In other words, how our current problem-solving approach works to solve narrow goals while externalizing harm in other places. Olivia shares about her experience staying with an indigenous community in the Amazon, during which she had a profound spiritual experience in which she felt more connected to the natural world than she had ever felt before, and how it completely shifted how she thought about her place in the world. We end the conversation talking about how, in reality, we are not separate from each other or from nature, and to understand that is to come to view ourselves and the world in all its holistic beauty. Quick note before we get started, if you haven't already listened to the first full episode of this podcast called What is the Metacrisis? I highly recommend you go back and listen to that first. It's really a foundational episode that provides a lot of the grounding that is important for all the episodes that follow. Olivia Lazard, welcome to the Entangled World podcast.
Thank you, Nadia. Happy to be here.
Yes, I am very excited to talk with you. As we were just talking about offline, I came across your work early last year. Your brilliant TED Talk first about energy blind spots. And I've continued to follow your work. And before we dig into all of that, there's a lot to dig into, but I'd love for you to just kind of start by sharing a bit about your story and how you've come to do the work that you do in the world.
Thank you. It's a long-winded journey that I took to get to where I am. It started off on something completely different. I started, fresh out of university, wanting to be amongst people who were working in favor of a more peaceful world. And I essentially sort of, started working in the field of peace building, dialogue facilitation, political mediation, and sort of conflict resolution writ large. And at the time, I wanted to understand how the political economy of conflicts functioned, especially in a globalized world. At the time, when I was studying, there was a sort of large understanding of conflicts as being sort of culturally specific, context specific, history specific, region specific, right? No conflict ever really looked alike in between different regions. And yet at the same time, already at the time when I was studying, I was just kind of like, well, surely in a globalized world, there are pressures or drivers that are coming from the outside, essentially, or that can mold or impact conflict zones and therefore sort of create fragility drivers of their own. And so I embarked on a journey where I started working in the Middle East, but then quite quickly I also worked in, Latin America, the African continent, the Asian region. And each and every time I was essentially sort of noticing a number of different patterns that were quite central in terms of elite capture or things around predation around certain types of resources, and identity or culture being used almost as a pretext or sort of amplified in terms of, like some of the fault lines that it could lead to. But I never found per se that there was any driver related to, people wanting to fight on the basis of identity or anything like this. Rather, it was, in my mind, very much related to issues of economies, political economies. And particularly, I think it was in 2012, 2013, where I was working a lot in the Central African region, which expands from Gabon to the eastern sort of, areas of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And I was noticing more and more some pressures which had to do with, armed groups or non-state actors, illicit financial groups, or even, like sort of second or third hand effects, like multinationals being interested in minerals, biodiversity, timber. And it was creating a bit of a perfect storm. When I was talking with armed groups themselves or with, sort of conflict affected communities, they were telling me stories about how they were essentially feeling more and more exposed to climate disruptions or the effects, the ecological effects essentially of deforestation in terms of change in rainfall patterns, change in health issues, change in displacement, more conflict as a result of less agricultural resilience. Um, and yet at the same time, there was, like all of these different sort of like fluxes that were sort of being activated because people were interested in minerals. And something just kind of ticked in my mind at some point when I saw a few things come in together. One was the effect of climate change and climate disruptions on certain regions and the impact it had on communities. The other thing was essentially the sort of effects of anthropogenic change, including those related to extraction. And then this picture, which at the time was not very clear, but an incoming competition essentially on minerals that not a lot of people had on their radar. Most of the time, when we were talking about extraction in the Central African region, it was gold or diamonds or that kind of thing, right? And then at a certain moment in history, particularly related to the boom around telecommunications, there was stuff around like tin and tungsten, the 3T sort of minerals, right? And then over time, it became cobalt. And then over time, there were other things that sort of, like popped up on my radar in very sort of subtle ways, but it was the start of something, which was rare earths. And particularly, I was struck because around the time when I was most often in the Central African region, I also saw much more of a presence of Russian actors, including Wagner mercenaries and Chinese corporations and Chinese companies around certain areas. And at the time, they were already also sort of, starting up to like starting in terms of cooperation. And I was just kind of like, well, it's funny because this is the moment when we're kind of starting as well to talk about the energy transition. And lo and behold, the energy transition is about a recoupling of our economies towards mineral resources to try and build up clean tech, solar panels, wind turbines. And obviously, they're not just necessary, those minerals are not just necessary for clean tech, they're necessary for tech, right? For digital stuff, for AI, for
For
military,
this thing.
exactly, for iPhones, for anything related to telecommunications, for everything which is essentially related to the so-called fourth industrial revolution, which couples essentially energy with an entry or sort of projection of economic activities in, the virtual world, which, a lot of people think is dematerialized, but it's not. It's very rematerialized. It's very recoupled essentially with extraction, with minerals. And obviously, and this is coming to the fore, and we can talk about it, like it's also related to military equipment as well. Those minerals are necessary for a lot of arsenals, which are on a modernization pathway, and which corresponds also to a military buildup, which in and of itself also sort of relates back to the whole story of the geostrategic component of the fourth industrial revolution, how everything is changing within geopolitical and geoeconomic systems because energy systems are changing, because climate change and ecological collapse is causing a lot of territorial change as well, or changes in sort of the relationship between nation states and resources as well as territory. And all of this is related essentially to, fundamental sort of fractures or fault lines that are emerging within our system, which is causing a lot of insecurity and therefore, military buildup, both as a way to project power, but also as a way to build up so-called deterrence. So all of this is essentially sort of, bringing me to what I do today, which I don't really know how to describe anymore, how to pin down in terms of a name. Giving a class earlier, and I was saying, well, I'm sort of studying or sort of, like researching everything related to the geopolitics of transitions. And people were like, what? Transitions? What do you mean, the energy transition? And I was like, yes, that's part of it, but it's not just that. We're transitioning everything. We're facing the kind of transformation of human civilizations and value systems, institutions, cultures, geopolitical balance of power in a way that we never have before, not to the extent, the scope, the dimensions that we have to deal with today. So that's me. Easy answer.
I want to go back a little bit to Olivia as a little girl.
Mm.
What kind of life experiences do you think kind of shaped the trajectory that you ultimately took in the work that you're doing?
It's a good question because it sits with me very often. The way I've talked about it, I think, with Nate on the Great Simplification podcast to a certain extent. One thing that I did mention was the fact that my family was very impacted by history with a big H. The two, like on both sides of my family and my grandparents were impacted and active in the Second World War in very different ways. My paternal grandfather, for example, was part of the resistance and was captured at some point and sent to a concentration camp, which was interestingly at the heart of the extractive and technological development of the Nazi system at the time. It was a concentration camp called Mauthausen. It was in Austria. And it was the place where the sort of Nazi regime extracted granite, or I think it's granite that you pronounce it in English, granite from. Granite was supposed to be the sort of stone that was meant to sort of lay the foundations of the Nazi culture or the Nazi civilization, right? It was supposed to be like a bit like the sort of marble in Italy.
Oh, fascinating.
And it was a key element, essentially, of the sort of Nazi cultural project, and political prisoners were used essentially in the quarry. It's not a mine. It's, an open air kind of extraction of a stone. And it was a mine where the political prisoners were supposed to die under the weight of the sort of stones that they carried. And eventually it became also the place where the Nazi regime fell back when the Allies started to sort of hit a number of key sort of technological development areas in Germany, in Hamburg, for example. And when the Nazi sort of, industrial capacity for armament started waning, and they sort of fell back on Mauthausen because it was amongst, like a number of hills, and they moved a number of concentration camp and industrial capacity inside, underground in the hills, which had to be built essentially with the help or, the slave labor essentially of the political prisoners. And my granddad was part of that. I think he experienced in a very intimate way in his flesh the place where humanity essentially, I don't exactly know how to describe it. I think, forgot itself and, dug itself in the darkest of ways. He survived it, and it informed everything that he knows essentially about the rest of his life, right? And it was not a very peaceful or sort of hopeful knowledge that he carried within him. He was very much haunted by the type of violence that he experienced and the type of inhumanity that he faced. And so it sort of informed my childhood very much because obviously it was, sort of violence, as we know, travels from one generation to the next, right? And it sort of knowing how to transform this, knowing how to take stock of the fact that that much inhumanity and that much violence exists within us as a species and as individuals is something that is a difficult legacy to hold, and yet a very sort of useful one. And the thing I think that sort of, balanced out everything was also the fact that my maternal grandmother had a very different experience of the war. She enrolled in the resistance when she was 17. She was part of, the sort of sheroes of her time. And she spent 6 years in the resistance, essentially sort of being part of the people who were fighting for what they believed in, and who did so at the peril of their life and at the peril of everything that they knew. But everything was, on the line for them, especially as a woman, I suppose. And she came out of the war. Thankfully, she never had to experience, obviously, what my paternal granddad would experience. So, again, a very sort of different type of reality that she had in her body and her flesh, right? But she came out of the war with a sense of pride for having stood up for what she believed in and for something that was just non-negotiable in her. The sense of freedom, the sense of identity, the sense of, it was not identity like in terms of soil, but identity in terms of she knew that she had to fight. She knew that she had to defend certain values that she couldn't imagine living without. And to, she died a couple years ago. She was just about to turn 100 years old. And what I owe her in terms of legacy is this sense of courage, this sense of always being in touch with something that that sort of radiates in you as a human being, and that is in touch with dignity, and that one has to constantly fight for and refine over time. And that was those, like, if I were to pin down something that really informed essentially how I was exposed to the fact that we are all part of a human march to a certain extent, and a sort of historical sort of journey, this is what sort of, struck me as a child. A sense of darkness and a sense of a very strong courage and the ability to stand no matter what, and to seek dignity and solidarity. And I took that, like a bit naively into my own journey as a child, and then as a young adult when I started working in peace building, which is obviously, this notion of like, we can build peace internationally. And then sort of like, I understood over time that, peace is made of not just the human will to make peace, but also, well, it's built on the back of energy architectures, of industrial architectures, of economic architectures. And by traveling to a lot of different places in the world, I understood essentially that it's related also to notions of power and very brittle geopolitical equilibriums that are constantly moving and at times going through very fundamental fault lines that, like the ones that we're talking about today. And it sort of it gave me a different understanding, a different education about what is necessary for peace to be built over time, and how to nurture solidarity also in ways that are maybe, traversing or going, cross culture and cross history. And that is, I think, the stake of our times. And it's both a beautiful one, but a very momentous and challenging one.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. That's a beautiful story. And it's so, I think it's so valuable to hear stories like that that are grounded in real life experiences, right? The challenges that we're facing, I think sometimes for some people can feel like this really fun and interesting intellectual puzzle to solve. And it is certainly a puzzle to solve. But it's so important that it is connected to a deep desire to preserve that which is sacred. And I can hear that in your words, in what informs you and what drives you in your quest to leave this place a little bit better than we all found it. So I appreciate the sharing of the story.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so going back to some of what you were sharing in terms of the connections that you were making through your life experiences, one of the things that you shared at the Stockholm Impact Week Norskin conference was you began by saying that we are on the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution.
Yeah.
And that this is an exciting prospect for many people who sort of envision a high-tech world of abundance supercharged by artificial intelligence. But your work and the work of many others shows that our current trajectory has us on a path to extinction, not to abundance. And so there's obviously a lot to unpack with this story. And so first, let's kind of start with going a little bit deeper into the blind spots of the energy transition and what those are and why that matters for how we take action in the world as we go down the path of decarbonization, which we ultimately need to do, but there's a lot of nuance on that pathway and an importance of doing that rapidly and doing it effectively and doing it justly.
Yeah. It's so my story with the blind spot sort of mantra, which indeed has become a bit of a mantra.
Yeah.
Started because I felt like I was being a bit gaslit with it was just like, oh, we can decouple our economies from fossil fuels or from carbon emissions, and we can dematerialize them because they're becoming virtual, is what I was saying before, right? And I was just kind of like, but I mean, surely, yes, when we talk about the sun and the wind and water, we talk about energy that is provided out of ecology and physics. It's renewable or regenerative, sorry. But the stuff that are built to collect that energy is certainly not, made out of air.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So can we talk about how we need to recouple in order to decouple? And once I started asking these questions, I understood that there was a lot of blind spot for a lot of people who were talking about a brave new world. They didn't know where minerals came from. They didn't know what clean tech was made of, sort of, and not just one thing. Technically, in order to make a solar panel or wind turbine, we can usually sort of, we have to rely on a number of different minerals. It's not just one, right? So it sort of all of a sudden sort of opens up the field of multiple supply chains. And I realized that not only did they not know or realize where, the mines were, either the current ones or the future ones to be created, but what was at stake from an ecological perspective and what was at stake from a geopolitical perspective, and how those two sort of components created something which was a security challenge of the type of proportions that we've never seen before in the history of humanity. And so I started sort of, digging into this story. Originally, the sort of entry point for me was saying, well, a lot of these minerals come from places that are fragile, that are conflict affected. And this is dangerous because we know that in fragile or, conflict affected zones, there is a high potential for so-called elite predation or elite capture, especially when there are sort of, like big bucks involved or big stakes involved related to extractive economies. Usually, when you have like big companies, either from fossils or minerals that sort of come into a country, they're usually attracted because, well, it's not that they're usually attracted. The government, in charge usually tries to lower tax incentives in order to bring these interests in, because usually it's related also to the building of infrastructure. But the fact essentially that there is no sort of systemic tax system into place eventually sort of, like opens the door for lack of redistribution, socioeconomic redistribution. And in some cases, it opens the door, depending on the sort of, like specific political economy of power, or the sort of number of geopolitical actors that come in, can open the door essentially to sort of bubbles of private wealth, elite predation, elite capture that build up at the level of the state, or sort of economic sectors, which then create a lot of inequality, inequity, marginalization, and propensity for violence over time, which has a number of ripple effects that I saw also sort of, like playing out in some circumstances where you've got people who end up essentially sort of creating either gangs or armed groups, or for that matter, also sort of joining violent extremist organization or radical groups of different types of religious or political declinations. So it has very important feedback loop effects and sort of, conflict potential or violence potential over time. The other thing that I wanted to point out, especially to sort of people in Europe, policymakers in Europe, who were relying on sort of globalization, to sort of get access to minerals and to deliver on their climate targets, is that there was a competition. There was a dangerous sort of competition being created between mitigation and adaptation. From a global perspective, right? Because not only are a lot of sort of potential deposits and reserves located in fragile countries, which raises a sort of high risk profile if you're not careful. A lot of the deposits and reserves can be found essentially in the underground of a number of critical ecosystems that are absolutely crucial for the stabilization of the climate regime, but also for the functioning of ecological services at local, national, regional, and for that matter, planetary levels. So typically, for example, if we add a lot of mining pressures to the Amazon and we end up compromising, for example, its ability to generate its own hydrological cycle, the effects don't just stop at the Amazon. It doesn't just stop at Brazil or Colombia. The effects are essentially sort of, trickle down with the lack of rainfall distribution, which is generated at the heart of the Amazon and which is, distributed to Southern America or to the border between Texas and Mexico or to the US Midwest or to the UK. And if you add up a number of sort of mines, not just in the Amazon, but in the Amazon and the Congo Basin and, the wet forests of Asia and the grasslands of Madagascar and the deep seas, for example, in the Pacific or, the Arctic, and you start mining at the same time, in space, which requires itself the construction of equipment which is built out of critical minerals, supposedly to go and fetch other types of critical minerals into space, right?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
start doubling, tripling, quadrupling down essentially on pressures, simultaneous pressures on a number of ecosystems, which if you compromise their local integrity is already bad enough. But if you compromise multiple ecosystems at the same time, you compromise also the ecological interdependencies that they generate and that holds our planet into equilibrium, right? And the problem in the mining conversation is that, because I want to be very clear about this, because like, in spite of all of this sort of picture that I'm sort of painting, the reality is that we still need to go about the energy transition, right? So that line needs to be very, very clear. The issue that I discovered and which I find concerning enough is that essentially when we sort of look at this picture of increased demand for minerals, either for clean tech or AI or digital equipment or military equipment or stuff like this, And you start then saying, okay, we need like 386 mines, for example, as Benchmark Minerals says, for storage capacity by 2035, which is technically, impossible. Impossible, vis-a-vis the sort of timelines involved and the weight involved. But the problem is essentially that there is never really a place in the world which is considered a no-go zone on behalf of ecological integrity, which is related to planetary insecurity or planetary stability, sorry. And the problem is that this is the case because we don't know exactly which specific places have a specific function for global planetary security, right, or stability. We have inklings in terms of regions, right? Again, the Amazon basin, if we push it too much, it's going to turn to savanna. It's going to have terrible consequences locally, but also in terms of tipping points and sort of ecological interdependencies. But, can you afford to mine in some places of the Amazon? No, part of the Amazon? Like, can we have that level of granularity that helps us to define what needs to remain untouchable today? Because there are certain places that are either way too brittle, way too fragile to afford to lose them, or because they're just too critically important in terms of their function for holding our planet together. And so this is essentially the other type of blind spot that we identified with a bunch of people. I remember I'm working with Professor James Dyke from the University of Exeter today. He's involved in work on the tipping point theory. And I remember in one of my studies, like calling him up and I was like, do you know if anybody has ever really looked systematically at the ecological costs of the energy transition? Has that work been done, and has it been integrated in a IPCC sort of transition pathway calculations, or sort of, global warming sort of, like pathways and scenarios and stuff like this? And I remember James, like sort of looking at me on Zoom and being like, I mean, he's British, so try to picture the Britishness there. He was like, surely somebody must have done it. Give me 2 days. And then he came back to me 2 days and, 2 days after, and he was like, actually, no, nobody has done it.
That is just wild to me. It is wild to me that there are hundreds of scientists looking at the ecological crisis, trying to understand many different factors outside of carbon emissions. Of course, that's one piece of it. But that this idea of the continued extraction of the planet matters. And it's important for us to look at that in the context of any kind of transition that we're going to make from an energy perspective. And just this idea that we can just infinitely extract, which kind of ties back to the conversation around space, right? Which is this idea of, well, if we can't extract on Earth, let's go extract from space.
Yeah.
There's a lot that we can talk about there. But keep going.
I think, it was so I had, like in my research, I had encountered studies. For example, the University of Queensland in Australia had identified that there were a lot of deposits and reserves that were sitting on biodiverse hotspots. And then there are other people who looked at the indigenous territory sort of correlation with deposits and reserves. And then there are some people who looked into water-stressed areas. But the picture was scattered, right? And it was not integrated essentially within the IPCC. Essentially, the IPCC or the IPBES, like especially the IPCC looks at obviously the sort of science of climate, right? And the sort of then adaptation and impacts of climate change. And then Working Group 3 works mostly on the sort of economic case and the business essentially to do the transition. But nobody was ever really tasked at looking at the impact of extraction indeed that would go into the building of this massive new infrastructure and architecture of energy that we were trying to build. And it was that one blind spot where we were like, oh wow, okay, so what we need to do is to essentially sort of create a conversation and a platform for a number of different disciplines and experts and people who have worked on bits and pieces, fractals essentially of this massive, problem that we are facing today, and which in some ways, what we're trying to do now with James and our team, including Emily Robinson, who's, also at University of Exeter, what we're trying to do is to try and sort of define, okay, so are there some places in the world where it's just not going to be, it should not be an option to mine. And what are the sort of criteria for that? And how do we ensure and enforce protection against mining and potentially other types of anthropogenic activities? And obviously, then if you start asking this question, it brings up another point, which is the other sort of massive geopolitical blind spot in the whole thing, which is emerging, full center now, which is the geopolitics of it. And the geopolitical blind spot started sort of emerging quite clearly as a result of, well, a few things in the past few years. The first thing was COVID. That was not a story that was typically related to critical minerals, but rather realizing that a number of supply chains, including medical ones, were very concentrated in terms of production and shipment potential in China, which represented a vulnerability, especially when it came to health issues, which are considered, well, which are a public good, right? You can't afford not to have a healthy population or a health system that supports a population going, any type of population going into sort of a pandemic, And then that sort of started raising a lot of concerns, especially at the time I was in Europe, and I remember, that there was a lot of panic around this. And then the war in Ukraine happened. And the war in Ukraine, and again, I'm speaking here with a lens that is a bit more sort of infused with European considerations, both because I was there, but because also there is something that emerged as a result of the war in Ukraine in terms of understanding, or a very hard-learned lesson. The war in Ukraine essentially revealed that being overly dependent on a provider for energy, which is at the basis of any type of economic activity or societal resilience, is not a good idea, because obviously it can be weaponized. And it sort of led to the collapse of a huge amount of faith, actually, that underpins normally the sort of European belief in what peace is made of, which is essentially interdependency.
The Bretton Woods Order. Yes.
And there you go, right? If you embed yourself with your neighbors, if you complexify global supply chains, if you provide a playing field where everyone has a stake in the global economy, then you have much reduced chances of people going to war with one another, at least from a systemic perspective. And then that kind of belief or faith system or ideological system, however you want to call it, just kind of got seriously dented, if not collapsed, at least in Europe. And so it's sort of, by transference essentially of understanding, it led to this realization that, oh God, energy can be weaponized. Well, we're not completely, sheltered from a world in which a country that both mines a lot of minerals, specifically rare earths, which are super important for magnets and digital sort of, stuff and military equipment, and not just mines them, but also process rare earths, and has, sort of learned how to sort of transfer that competency to other types of minerals like lithium, cobalt, graphite, actually like a lot of different minerals. China essentially sort of, processes the majority of minerals in the world today, and has acquired the industrial and technological know-how to do this. Well, China may come into a moment of history where it may be able to weaponize these things, which underpin every single economic sector for the most part in a lot of economies around the world, especially energy, and for that matter, even service-oriented ones like Europe, like the US, Canada, Australia. And the concern did not just come out of thin air or just out of the sort of lesson learned from the war in Ukraine with Russia, it came also from the fact that China has a track record, actually, of weaponizing a number of different supply chains. The first time that it did so was against Japan, when there was essentially a sort of issue in 2010 that involved, fishermen, and eventually sort of it led to China cutting off the supply for certain key minerals to Japan. Japan is a high-tech economy. If you stop its provision of certain key minerals, its economy can be very seriously sort of slowed down or brought to its knees very quickly. So that was the start of a realization, essentially, and the realization then extended beyond that, and that's part of like the stuff that I do today, which is exactly understanding like what the geopolitics of critical supply chains convey in terms of picture regarding the balance of power, the shifts, the transitions in balance of power. Because essentially, we now live in a world where China has perfected the verticalization of supply chains for a number of minerals. It doesn't just make it an industrial heavyweight, it makes it a technological heavyweight, including for stuff like electric vehicles, which are now being overproduced with the intention essentially to have export capacity. This export capacity is now sort of, arriving to a number of different markets around the world. The BYD vehicles, for example, are very cheap compared to others, especially of more European brands, or even Teslas for that matter. So they have a potential essentially to be uptaken quite quickly, which is in a way, and that's the sort of difficulty of it. It's very good from a climate perspective, right? You can't sort of point fingers at China for rolling out massively and super fast a number of solar panels and wind turbines and sort of EVs around the world, because that's what we want, right? We want to go as fast as possible for the climate. But the issue comes from, some of the stuff, the economic sort of policies and technological policies that are related essentially to this rollout, and which raise some questions from a purely sort of security perspective, right? Because a BYD is essentially a computer on wheels. It has reconnaissance capacity. It has espionage capacity. It has critical infrastructure mapping capacity. And when you start adding up essentially all the stuff that China is building or exporting around the world, both as a public good, but as a public good that can, create security fault lines of its own, because they control a lot of information and data that goes back to China. We have no idea what it's done, what it's doing with the data and what it could eventually be used for, especially in a world with AI capacity. But that it relates to critical infrastructure, for example, which can be turned off potentially from afar, including for energy systems or for how to potentially weaponize certain things. You start having essentially a number of question marks about what kind of world we're eventually walking into. And a lot of, Chinese sort of industrial actors and technological actors will say essentially, but it's innocuous. It's part of a rolling out essentially of the stuff that we need. But what we've observed essentially with China is that there is a constant sort of black box. There is a plausible deniability around the intentions also, and the sort of potential dual use of certain technologies, including for climate security purposes. And then, the other blind spot is, again, not just China, but Russia. And I mean, I'm happy to sort of go, briefly into it, but I don't want to make it a monologue, however. So I can, eventually sort of, circle back to Russia if you want. But it has significant implications in terms of the shift in the balance of power that we're walking into essentially at the moment. And with the future of democracy, the future of freedom, the future of human rights, the future of open societies is essentially like in the future, and which is coming on the back of the energy and digital transitions at the moment.
Yeah, let's actually talk a little bit about Russia, because it is something that I wanted to talk with you about, is the ways in which the news media is covering the conflict in Russia and Ukraine. Um, I suspect is not the full story. So I'd love to hear any insight you have on sort of where the conflict stands at this moment, or what implications you think it has for all the things that we've been discussing.
Ukraine is, I mean, we all know it. It's in a critical, it's in danger is the right word.
Yeah.
And it's not just Ukraine which is in danger. Ukraine is a bit like the it depends on how you want to look at it in terms of metaphor, the tip of the iceberg or one of the sort of tectonic plates which is moving at the moment. It's the start of something rather than a contained conflict about borders or about history. If you triangulate essentially different data points about Russia going back to 2008, you realize that what is happening in Ukraine is part of a much larger story. Let me maybe start around 2007, 2008, going back to a number of different sort of security documents from the Kremlin, which I analyzed in sort of in blocks, right? I didn't just look at the sort of national security policy, but rather the national security policy along with ecological security, water security, foreign and defense policy, and that kind of thing. And once you start analyzing, like the evolution of the documents, it tells a story which has evolved over time. And the story is this. Fairly early on, Russia understood that there were systemic shifts that were about to happen. Climate change and ecological change were about to bring a lot of instability within the system, within our planet, right, within our international system. There were a number of economic stagnations that were going to happen in Europe, partly also in the US, which the US countered by sort of, going towards fracking and, energy, but which essentially sort of told the story of an economy which was essentially going to sort of stabilize at a certain level of growth and which was, going to struggle a little bit. And it also sort of identified that China and a number of other actors within the sort of global economic system were on the rise, and that China would particularly sort of create a swell of massive repercussions, of massive implications, massive importance. And that all of this was essentially sort of going to shift the balance of power, and that in this context, Russia had an interest in playing on diversification and on self-sufficiency or autonomous resilience, let's put it this way. So the story of diversification happened essentially around energy. It preempted the fact that Europe wanted to shift away from, fossils, and that it would sort of, go towards climate ambitions that would make it grow its appetite in critical minerals. Russia identified that fossil demand would need to pivot towards Asia. And it also identified that the world would also need more nuclear power. So it played on all three different forms of energy provision. And I'll come back to that in a second. The other thing that it realized is that Russia, obviously by the sheer size of its territory, has a very, very strong asset in the form of agricultural land. Not just that, in the form of water. It has 1/5 of the world's water resources, for now. And its endowment in water is going to increase with climate change. As Europe and the Middle East and other regions in the world lose gradually their climate niche as a result of climate change and anthropogenic activity, Russia will gain in relative terms, in relative abundance terms. And once it sort of, gains in more water endowment, it's not just in quantity, it's also sort of, in terms of redistribution across its territory, which gives it more potential to expand in terms of agricultural land, but also in industrial capacity. The thing that it is lacking in terms of industrial capacity, is technology. The technology obviously is either something that you can get from the West if you're in relatively sort of stable terms with the West or good terms with the West. And if you're not, then you can potentially get technology from China, for example. So put this picture together, and then let's look back at what happened over the last 15 years with what Russia did. It obviously offered gas at a fairly cheap rate to Europe, especially in the wake of the financial crisis when Europe started to suffer from a macroeconomic perspective. It embedded, therefore, a number of dependencies that were economically and financially crucial at the time for Europe, especially for Germany, which is the industrial powerhouse of Europe. And then I found some documents which were really interesting, that the Kremlin essentially ordered the creation of a number of different sort of desks within the government around 2010, 2011, which were dedicated essentially to critical minerals. And the purpose of these desks was to essentially sort of reinvest the capacity of a number of industrial actors, Nornickel or Rosatom, for that matter, to try and sort of, build up its capacity in terms of critical minerals and to recover, and that's an important piece of historical sort of aspect as well, to recover the former primacy which existed during the time of the Soviet Union regarding how to extract, process, and export a number of critical minerals. And it was the case, indeed. The USSR was a very strong actor in that sense, which then collapsed, and then China took over essentially in the sort of mid-90s around how to process critical minerals and how to extract. And then it obviously sort of, started expanding in terms of its nuclear capacity. And today, a number of nuclear reactors around the world are being constructed, over 50% of them using Russian technology. And Russian uranium is also instrumental, including for a number of reactors in Europe, right? And so it started investing its own capacity at home. At home, it meant essentially that in terms of critical minerals, it was very important for nickel, for titanium, for tantalum, because Russia has a number of prime quality grade minerals in those sort of series within its own territory, which is very vast. It also has a number of rare earth deposits, but they're not sort of systematically exploited, and they lack a lot of technology and investments. But what Russia also did is that it essentially sort of looked at the rest of the world, and it was like, well, okay, demand for critical minerals is going to increase, so we're going to try and sort of, we don't have the capacity that China has, which it developed through its Belt and Road Initiative and, through investments that sort of created some exchanges between sort of primary extraction of, resources in countries of the global south against construction of infrastructure or liquidities and, sort of construction of connectivity networks and stuff like this, right? But Russia had another type of power, which is rogue power. And if you correlate essentially the presence of Wagner troops with mineral-endowed countries in Africa particularly, you realize that the deployment of mercenaries was not exactly random between the Central African Republic, the Sahel, some places also like, Cameroon. It was not necessarily Wagner that was there, but the Kremlin struck a military partnership that included geological sort of surveying within the military partnership. Madagascar is another country where a number of different sort of security-oriented services were provided to the president and to certain key people, including in exchange for the extraction of a chrome mine, which now belongs to satellite companies of Wagner. And you start sort of, putting all of this picture together, and you're like, well, they're not extracting the way that, China is extracting today, right? They don't have the same kind of economies of scale capacity. But what they do have is a presence which is menacing enough and which holds, like key access, geostrategic access to deposits and potential reserves that other people may be interested in.
Yeah, like the US.
Like the
Also,
US,
right? Yeah.
like China,
Like China.
like,
Yes.
European powers or
European.
powers, countries.
Mhm.
Um, and therefore, it gives it a sort of, brokering capacity for the supply chains of the future. Whoever is interested in certain types of deposits or certain places in Africa or, in other places needs to go through Russia. And Russia can then use this for different political gains. Or in the case of Europe, to try and make sure that Europe can fail in the delivery of its climate ambitions. The climate ambitions which are legally binding, which are almost at the heart now of a sort of like, we don't really have a constitution at the sort of, European level, but the Green Deal requires the 27 member states to decarbonize at least by 50%, 55% by 2030, and to become completely carbon neutral by 2050. If Europe fails in this timeline, it will have a fundamental societal fracture, an intergenerational fracture, a democratic fracture. It will prove a point about how democracies are simply unequipped to deliver on energy security, on economic security, on democratic promises. And if it fails to do so, and if essentially, there are sort of feedback effects or feedback loops with populations that essentially sort of rise up against governments because they fail in their climate targets, then this is, the kind of risk that is very exploitable for political purposes, and which fractures that lend themselves to being magnified through influence operations and through disinformation campaigns. And this is already what's happening, right? A number of different sort of protests that we can see in Europe are, of course, happening with their own drivers, but themselves being amplified by disinformation campaigns, rogue campaigns, and influence operations campaigns that can be traced back to the Kremlin. And this shows you essentially that there's something much wider at stake. And that's where I land back on Ukraine, because it provides essentially this link, to something. It's the door to a lot of different things, right? Ukraine was attacked, and if you listen to Mr. Putin, Ukraine was attacked because Ukraine belongs to Russia. Historically, linguistically, culturally, politically. And the current leadership of Ukraine is neo-Nazi, is, corrupting the very soul of Ukraine. And Russia is there to save Ukraine
Save them.
and Ukrainians, right? Right. When you start looking at timeline, resources, and sort of storytelling, you start sort of understanding also what's behind the current sort of propaganda of Mr. Putin. Ukraine is one of the richest countries on the European continent. It is rich, obviously, in fossils. It is rich in uranium. It is rich in critical minerals, including lithium, rare earths, and other types of minerals. Interestingly, a lot of the minerals are located east of the country. The very same places which have been at the very heart of influence operations and disinformation and misinformation operations organized by the Kremlin, to try and essentially organize, manufacture, and eventually break the territorial integrity of Ukraine. The European Union, back in the summer of 2021, had struck a strategic partnership with Ukraine, specifically oriented towards how to build an industrial economy around those critical minerals, which are now unexploitable because the war makes it impossible to exploit anything except if you're in Russian protected territories and you want to extract and you want to sell to China, which is partly what's happening. That was also the sort of, the moment when Europe realized, oh, we're not just dependent on Russia for fossils. We may be dependent on Russia and on Eastern Europe for critical minerals that Russia is trying to sort of compromise access to. But the story goes beyond as well, because Ukraine is not just rich in those energy or material stuff. It is super rich in agricultural soils, in black soils particularly, Kernizem, which have a faster ability to produce yields. I think it's 2 or 3 different types of yields per year compared to average soils which are ecologically exhausted. It's not just the case of Ukraine, it's the case of a number of countries around the Black Sea. It's one of the particularities essentially of this bioregion. And Kernizem also exists within Russia, right? It's a sort of continuation essentially of its bioregion. No, not of its bioregion. It's a particularity of this bioregion, which covers Russia and a number of Black Sea countries. Yeah. Let's be precise here about the language because it matters.
I like that clarity.
Right. And when you put this back into a data point with what Russia is trying to do, it is trying to essentially build its ability to become an agricultural powerhouse in the future as other regions in the world lose their climate niches or food resilience in the face of climate change. And if you look essentially at the Russian behavior with the grain story, since the start of the war in Ukraine, it gives you a template. It gives you a blueprint for what Russia is turning out to project essentially in terms of its ability to use power in the future. What Russia wants to do is to use a number of different types of supply chains, from an energy perspective, a material perspective, and a food perspective, potentially in the future a water perspective, if at some point water becomes commodified as a result of multiple pressures coming from private sector actors, combined with climate change, combined with anthropogenic change, and where we lose essentially resilience of water systems worldwide, and certain key countries will become providers essentially of water security in the future. Imagine a future where Russia is one of those, where Russia is essentially one of the countries that can hold food, grain, energy, materials hostage to its political ambitions. And let's look at these political ambitions. These are ambitions where essentially we have a political economy of power in the Kremlin, which is organized around one man which essentially uses corruption, which uses intimidation, which uses murder, and which uses propaganda in order to try and bend the will of anybody to his, and which turns a number of different sort of historical narratives or political narratives in a way that essentially serves imperialistic, fascist, and totalitarian ambitions. This is a country which is likely to have relative power very quickly as a result of those geopolitical risks and the sort of changes that are happening as a result of climate change. And this is why there is something which, when Ukrainians are saying we're fighting for everyone, this is not a joke. This is not a manner of speaking. They are at the front line of a new fight against new forms of fascism and totalitarianism, which have no qualms about reducing human dignity to nothing.
I'm having an emotional reaction to everything you're sharing right now.
It's a very heavy, it's a very heavy topic.
Yeah.
And I think that this is a story that needs to emerge because we're not conscious of everything that is at stake and the ways in which all of those transitions are playing in the hands of something which at the moment is not likely to, lead us to a climate safe or peaceful future. And this is why, like the sort of whole battle of narratives is so loaded, because it's hiding something much darker behind.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as you're having this moment, this is also why, for me, I can tell you, I have these moments very often. I walk with a sort of emotional weight of this
I can imagine.
very
Yeah.
often. But this is why I keep reminding myself of my heritage from my grandparents. Humans are capable of very deep darkness, and we can stand up to it. We can stand up to it when we understand the stakes and we understand coherently what's at stake.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this is one of the very key things that we need to work on at the moment. And this is why, indeed, like all of the stuff around disinformation it is one of the key battlegrounds. Because, if you don't know what the truth, or like, it's not that I hold the truth, right? But like parts of what is happening in terms of trends that are emerging, if we don't take care of the future that we want to create, and if we don't take care of it collectively, understanding today that, what is happening in Europe has a relationship to what is happening in Africa, has a relationship to what's happening in the US, the UK, Latin America, China, all of these different things, then we don't really stand a chance actually of indeed creating this climate safe and this peaceful future that we inherently all hope for. It's all fine if we're at a moment of history where we need to sort of renegotiate international institutions, macroeconomic systems, geoeconomic, sort of relations and that kind of thing. It's slippery, it's complex, it's difficult. But if we, sort of look at it from the perspective of how to do it so as to get on the other side of those massive threats that are coming our way, then we find ways. But the starting point needs to be, we kind of need to agree that we all want to live lives that are based on dignity, that are based on solidarity, that are based on a certain sense of freedom. This is a very philosophical debate that we may be entering right there, but there is a sense of why freedom is
This
important,
is an important
right?
one. Yes. Yes.
And how we can sort of band together. But it is heavy.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know you've done quite a lot of work around the sort of political ecology of conflict. And I'm curious, what have you sort of learned about the causal factors? This is where we're going to go more philosophical, but about the causal factors of conflict amongst humans. Like if you were to methodically sort of peel away the layers of our large-scale conflicts, what do you think is at the root of why humans find themselves in conflict? I know it's a big question.
So many different, bits and pieces of answer, and nothing which is coherent enough or sort of, which can boil things down. I've seen some conflicts where, if I look at the sort of local forms of conflict, when I was working particularly in some key areas of Africa, there had been so much hurt over time, which indeed sort of go back generations, that the hurt was indeed sort of preventing people from engaging with one another with a real sense that, they can live with one another. This was originally partially created as a result of local conflicts around how to share land, but it was obviously worsened and vastly complexified as a result of eras of colonialism and sort of forced displacements of people, which created legacies essentially of historical contestations. But the sort of local dimensions, they can tell bits and pieces of the story, but the story is indeed, to a certain extent about how to. I was reading recently a book that sort of made me think quite strongly, right, about the history of the Anthropocene. I think it's called The Human Planet, by Simon Lewis and Maslach. Really interesting book, which spends quite a bit of time explaining why scientists are having trouble defining whether or not the Anthropocene started and when it started. But what I found really interesting about the way that it sort of goes about the sort of scientific debates is that it highlights 4 different historical eras that marked the Anthropocene, if we want to look at the world via the lens of the Anthropocene. The first one was they can trace back initial sort of human impacts on the biosphere to the agricultural revolution, which goes back a long time ago. This was the moment when humans settled down and started building so-called civilizations, organized hierarchical societies, which partially introduced this notion of domestication of animals particularly, and task allocation, and who gets the right to design institutions or who doesn't, which all 3 of these different things can be considered as sort of initial forms of violence in some sense, right?
Inequality, social hierarchy.
Right.
Yeah.
And even, towards animals, right? Like the domestication of animals is sort of life force for labor, is something that supposedly may have been foreign before. The moments when sort of human populations, mind you, I'm not a sort of natural scientist or a historian going back, like before sort of agricultural revolutions, or even after for that matter. But I think I have a sort of understanding of history that before, humans settled down in agricultural societies, they were nomadic because it was also a function of how they also adapted the different atmospheric, climatic, and sort of, ecosystemic and ecological conditions. The equilibrium back then, or the consensus that I've heard of, is that, there was an equilibrium essentially between people and sort of other species and between different tribes or different movements of, people. And obviously we were talking about much reduced sort of like, populations, human populations, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But over time, essentially sort of, creating this template over how to create permanent types of institutions or societal organizations on the basis of
being able to store surplus.
There you go. Created an incentive all the time. Surplus amount into security at the time, right? It was a normal reaction to try and sort of, temper against unpredictability or insecurity in the future. It made sense. But over time, essentially, it sort of, created pressures on land that required expansion. It also allowed, for that matter, for population growth, which also required expansion. And over time, there was essentially this thing that this mechanism that was created, which related extraction to expansion to ecological exhaustion. And the more we sort of exhaust, the more we have to move or to change sort of means of production. And, to cite another book, Dirt, I don't remember the name of the author. He's great. He tells a story, which I find extraordinary, which is that at some point the Roman Empire decided to invade Carthage, which, is in modern day Tunisia. And there was a person apparently who brought a fig from Carthage to Rome saying, this is the best fig that ever existed, right? It was like, it had a very specific type of taste. It was apparently very plush and, like very sort of delicious and sort of very, it was a sign of, I think, refinement in Carthage. And there was a decision essentially on the basis of figs to invade Carthage. And that happened at a moment when the Roman Empire was running out of agricultural resilience at home. So it expanded. And that tells a story which keeps on repeating itself, which is a story of security dilemmas, which are either internal in the case of, like the sort of Roman Empire, or for that matter, of a more sort of competitive nature. One of the other moments that, Simon Lewis and Maslick mention in the history of the Anthropocene is the colonial era, and how it very clearly had an impact on the biosphere, and we can measure it and we can notice it, right? And the colonial era was itself born out of a number of different factors, right? History is always complex, but one of them was essentially that you had a number of European empires that were competing with one another. And parts of the way in which they were competing with one another was, one, over resources, over space, but also over this program at the time, this sort of vision of the age of discovery and the age of conquest, right? And when European powers decided to go out into the unknown, which was not fully unknown, but to the majority was, right? Then it started sort of arriving in places that, depending on how you sort of look at the specificities of Portugal against France, against the UK, against the Netherlands and things like this, they had different societal models of their own that they wanted to sort of, expand and wanted to sort of gain control and export essentially to other places in the world. But these places in the world that were colonized essentially became, sort of places of extraction for spices, for timber, for agricultural land, for rubber, for eventually sort of, other forms of trades, including the slave trade. And that is a pattern that, if you look back at the agricultural revolution, it's again sort of a pattern of how do you complexify societal organizations and how do you support this level of complexity over time. And if you look at it in that sort of purely technical way, you start thinking, well, in order to support it, we need to extract, we need to expand, we need to conquer. And that is a story that you find as a repeat in all different sort of moments. And one key element of that era was the security dilemma between a number of empires, how to compete with one another so as to create a balance of power using other places in the world, extracted sort of, like goods or people in order to compete with one another and to maintain a very brittle equilibrium. And today, and this is why the fourth industrial revolution is of significance, when Simon, Lewis, and Maslick looked at the history of the Anthropocene, they looked at 4 different moments. I believe that we're in the 5th one. Because essentially we're trying to create 2 things simultaneously, which have sort of potential for expansion in terms of ideas and in terms of mechanisms and in terms of ripple effects of their own right. We're trying to change supposedly an energy system. Here, there is space for disagreement because actually for now, we're not really changing. We're stacking up sources of energy rather than sort of reaching a tipping point towards renewables. But at the very least, we're essentially sort of trying to add another set of architectures within the energy infrastructure of the world. That obviously has implications for where we get those stuff from, where we install those stuff from, what that means in terms of balance of power regarding what energy sort of creates in terms of relationship between countries. But then the other part is that we have coupled essentially the energy transition, the decarbonization project, with the digitalization project. Mm-hmm. And digitalization is where things start going very wrong. Because not only are they materially intensive, they are water intensive, they are energy intensive, and they open up essentially the history of humanity to a new chapter, which may open up its history to new levels of violence. That's why I'm particularly concerned about where this fourth industrial revolution is going, because the previous moments of historical leaps within the Anthropocene were accompanied always by new stories of extraction, expended, doubled down every time, which resulted essentially in the climate crisis that we have, right? But every step was also essentially accompanied by new levels of violence. Typically, the fourth step that Simon Lewis and Maslick explore is the moment when we can observe within biospheric systems the traces of uranium and nuclear testing. This tells a story of dual use, how to look at energy as a potential form of abundance, but also how we've developed military capabilities and destructive capabilities on the back of a new form of access to energy, a new form of science, a new form of technological development. So it takes the story essentially from a story of agriculture, organization in terms of hierarchy, to a story of expansion, security dilemmas between a number of countries that had repercussions, terrible repercussions on other societies in the world and on the biosphere. Then there was the history of the Industrial Revolution, which is the third step that they talk about, which is a great acceleration, a systematization essentially of a number of different sort of things, sort of extractive and productive means that were systematized across different regions, which we've seen obviously an acceleration with globalization as well. And then the last step that they talk about is the sort of nuclear age, which tells a story of energy turned technology, technology turned into new means of violence. And now we're shifting energy systems. We're opening up the chapter of AI, which some people are saying it's going to, enhance productivity. It's going to optimize humans. It's going to make
It's going to solve climate change. It's another
exactly.
narrative
It's going
hear.
to look at it very efficiently. And then, some people like, I think it's Suleiman, who is part of the people who created AI, is telling us it's the biggest danger to humanity ever. Mm-hmm. And indeed, the particularity essentially of all of these different moments that we talked about before is that innovations always came as a result of certain types of logic, and they made perfect sense at the time. The agricultural revolution was a form of security, of creating security. The age of discoveries and the age of colonialism was how to support populations that were growing, and how to sort of solve the problem of ecological exhaustion partly in Europe, and how to create a balance of power and therefore create security between security sort of deterrence essentially between different countries. Mm-hmm. And then the nuclear age was also sort of came out of supposedly a necessity partly, which was the necessity of trying to overcome enemies during the Second World War, which is a massive weapon of deterrence. So all of these different steps had their own rational sort of logic, right? And did look, in some ways, innocuous to a certain extent,
Yeah.
because they created a rapport to security, which was, well, we need it, right? And this is also
Yeah.
what's happening
Yeah.
today.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just going to say, I think of the Green Revolution, the sort of response to food insecurity. And without a sort of attempt to identify the possible knock-on effects that would come from the Green Revolution. So the impact of pesticides, the impact of runoffs into oceans, all of the other sort of ecological impacts that we've seen due to the use of pesticides, that this way that we've gone about trying to solve our global challenges just seems to continue to make more and more challenges. And so how do we get out of this loop? What is a path forward possibly look like?
I suppose you're catching me on a day where I'm a bit emotional as well, and I want to say, oh, I don't know. But
yeah.
it's not.
Yeah, and I don't expect you to have an answer to that question, obviously. It's almost a ridiculous question to ask, but I suppose what I'm trying to get at is what are maybe the small steps forward that can start to get us more towards the direction that we need? Like, how do we turn this massive ship? How do we veer off this course that we're on? And I don't think the answer is expanding to space and extracting from space, and we can talk about that if you'd like. Because that is the answer for many people.
It is, yeah, and I don't get it. Again, like, this is the moment where I feel gaslit, because I'm like, but it doesn't, like, it doesn't solve anything. And if you want to move to Mars, your, organs are not fit for the gravitational force of Mars. Like, it's just like, what are we trying to do here? Anyways,
yeah. Well, this is where AI comes in, right? If we can upload our consciousness to some digital universe, then the experience on Mars becomes a livable one. I'm not quite sure.
I don't know. And this is the part also, like, this whole thing about AI, like, I remember, I think it was Zuckerberg that said, I was talking about it, I think, on another podcast, and I hope that I'm not getting this wrong, but I think it was Zuckerberg at some point who said, AI and virtual reality will help us to get rid of our physicality, of the weight of our physicality. And I'm just kind of like, I'm sorry, but I kind of like my body. I like having senses. I like being able to physically relate to the world. This is how I experience it. This is what makes me human. Like, I don't want to let go of it. I don't like, to think of it as a weight. It is a channel. It is an experience. It is, like, embodiment. Like, I just, like, for me, this is the moment where I'm like, are you sure you don't want to go and see a psychologist, maybe, to just kind of, like, talk about this?
This for me goes back to, it's like the roots of it seem to go back to the days of René Descartes, right? Like this Cartesian split in between the body and the mind, and, the ideologies of domination of nature, and just all of these things, all of these stories that have sort of evolved over time, and in some ways have become so deeply embedded into our thinking that we don't even know that they're there. We don't even know that they're driving the ways that we're acting in the world, right? And this is why one reason I think it's so important to understand history is that you can start to peel back these layers a little bit, and you can then take a step back and say, where do my beliefs come from? Where do my assumptions about how life works come from? Maybe start to ask those questions, and perhaps that then leads us down a different path. Ultimately, I think our fragmented consciousness is what's gotten us into this mess. So how do we get out of that? How do we go back to viewing life from a place of wholeness? And not to say that the scientific revolution and all the advances that came from it, being able to take things apart and really dive deep into examining them and analyzing them, doesn't have their benefits. But we've become so divorced from the connections in life and from the wholeness that we are all a part of, that our problem-solving approach just continues to go down this path of humans dominating everything. Humans are the smartest creatures on the planet. Humans will figure out the path forward. And if we can just control the right things and pull the right levers, we'll get there.
I completely agree with you. And it inspires another type of response to your earlier question. I have found in my journey that there are specific things that give me hope. One of them is complex regeneration. And here I need to make a bit of a tangent. A number of years ago, I took a year off and I went backpacking, working on farms, actually, in Australia, in Thailand, in Kenya. And I specifically wanted to learn about permaculture. So I went to work on farms. I was woofing, as we say, just learning about permaculture and sort of regenerative agriculture. And at that moment, I didn't really know what it was. And then when I started working in the places, especially there was a striking moment for me. Australia is obviously like a piece of rock in the middle of the ocean. And, it's like quite impressive to see just like, almost desert, not like Sahara desert, but rocky desert for like miles and miles, like in front of you. And I remember working at a farm which was sitting in a very deserted landscape and which was super lush. It was beautifully green and there was a lot of biodiversity and you could find a lot of water there. And there was a lot of different species that were growing, including old ones. And that's the moment when something just kind of, one of my belief systems changed, because I thought that once you sort of lose water or you lose your soils or you lose nature essentially around you, you can't gain it back. And it's not the case. You can, once you start working with nature through specific types of methodologies, right? Understood, it's not just about planting trees for the sake of sequestering carbon, but it's about sort of working with the topography, working with the elements around you, understanding essentially how certain landscapes behave and how you can replant water, how you can sort of recreate water retention landscapes. And from there, by working with water as the connective tissue or force that it is, you start essentially rebooting an entire sort of, like virtuous cycle around the recreation of life. And it sparked an idea. It sparked an idea which was, well, if they can do it at a farm level, can that be done at a much wider level? Can we essentially rebuild? Rebuild is probably not the right word. Can we reignite ecological services? Can we work with water at a much wider level and space and help essentially nature help us? And it's of specific relevance for, the sort of the conversation around the material footprint of the energy transition today. Because when I talk to mining actors, what they tell me, amongst many things, is, well, we're going to have a lot of trouble with this transition because we're running out of water. And water is really important for extraction and for processing. It's actually, if we run out of water, we won't have the energy transition. It's not just a question of, some people say that we may run out of minerals. I don't think so. Obviously, we can't sort of satiate minerals for the next 200 years for, a demand which goes beyond the sort of creation of clean tech infrastructure, and which is supposed to feed like constantly evolving new tech and, change of iPhones every year. But I think that we can indeed sort of move in the direction of this energy transition and accelerate towards it. But it requires a regenerative revolution at a planetary scale. And the good news in the story there, if we let ourselves be really imaginative, at least to start the ignition of imagination, because I think that it will lead us way beyond what I'm about to talk about. But water is, we're releasing tons and tons and tons of water as a result of our anthropogenic activities. And it's now evaporating faster out of soils and out of the oceans as a result of climate change. So essentially, we're transforming water from a liquid form or an embedded form in terms of its soil and vegetation into a gaseous form. We're turning it into water vapor. It goes directly into the atmosphere. Water vapor is a greenhouse gas. It accelerates essentially the effects of carbon dioxide, and it holds more and more heat dynamics essentially within the atmosphere, or it accelerates heat dynamics. And this is why we're seeing, it's not, like of course, like climate change is what is causing a number of droughts and sort of flash floods and inundations and floods and fires and that kind of thing. But if you sort of boil down those elements and those hazards, they're the result of either too much water or too little water. So they're essentially the result of a broken hydrological cycle. If we were to look at water now and how it behaves in the atmosphere and how we have broken essentially the pathways of atmospheric rivers, which used to sort of rely on interconnected ecosystems that had, sort of strong integrity, we realize essentially that water moves into the atmosphere in a certain way, that we've disrupted that way, and that we have a capacity essentially to work with water to try and recreate a sense of stability in terms of how to rebuild water security at soil level, at aquifer level, at river levels. I am not here, talking about we're still going through climate change, so there's going to be a number of impacts that are intractable. But we can work with water to rebuild a sense of, water security in order to sustain essentially a sense of habitability, economic activity, to support essentially, like, in a weird way, what I'm trying to sort of, tell extractive actors is you need regeneration in order to extract. We actually need a regenerative revolution in order to pass the sort of hump of this energy transition, which is extractive reliant. And if we don't do that, we will lock ourselves back into the use of fossil fuels, which obviously will lead us closer to a termination shock and a collapse and potentially extinction because of the rapidity and the fast pace of climate change, right? So essentially trying to sort of even insert this logic of how to work with nature, even within this logic of industrial development and extractives, but whilst at the same time saying your fourth industrial revolution has an expiry date. And we're going to have to start investigating the role of innovation, right? Which essentially creates logical pathways that we lock ourselves into and which over time create more and more and more and more and more demand for extraction, and which create those security dilemmas which we're stuck in at the moment. And we need to find ways essentially to unstuck ourselves, to de-escalate geopolitical competition, which is playing out essentially in the technological field. And we need to put a cap essentially on a certain sense of where those sort of technological sectors are leading us. We need to potentially sort of say, okay, well, we're going to have a moratorium on certain types of technological developments, and we're going to have to see how we can, at the very least, give us a sense of, okay, the next 10 years actually make a break. If we do not invest into these new ecological pathways, if we are not able to prioritize certain sectors, such as clean tech sectors, diversify also the sort of offer, not take it away from China, right? China is an incredibly important actor in the energy transition, but also new centers need to sort of, bring to the fore to reduce the pressure of this security dilemma, essentially. But we need to prioritize clean tech sectors to get over the hump of this energy transition. We need to put the brakes on a number of technological innovations, and we need to prioritize the biosphere. Because if we don't, we will come to the end, essentially, of this carrying capacity that the planet can support in order to have complex civilizations. And this is only an intermediary step that I'm talking about, right?
Yeah, it's buying us time, what you're talking about.
Exactly.
Right? There's so much wisdom, so many insights you've shared. There's so much to unpack. One of the things that I did want to ask you about is I know you spent some time in Ecuador with indigenous communities, and I'm curious what your reflections were from that experience and how that sort of has influenced the way that you're thinking about our path forward as a society. And the reason I'm asking that, well, there's an obvious reason I'm asking that. Just the question I think is an interesting one, but I'm also really quite interested in the application, and not in an extractive colonialist kind of way, but the sort of reintegration of indigenous and ancient wisdom and wisdom that was developed in traditional societies over thousands of years that we can come back to help us figure out the path that we chart forward. What can we learn? What can we pay homage to? What can we thank our ancestors for? What can we do to pay it back for our ancestors? All of those questions.
My time in Ecuador was one of the turning points in my life. I was there. I was there originally working with the Carter Center. I was an intern at the time, learning about mediation, because the Carter Center was working on the sort of conflict between Ecuador and Colombia, which had protracted over time as a result of the drug trade and the FARCs and a number of illicit activities. Completely by chance, I was staying in a house where some people introduced me to indigenous communities and shamans, essentially. And they were curious about what I was doing, so we spent a lot of time talking. I was very happy just to, share what I was learning and to share about, what my view of the stakes were, but also to learn essentially from them about who they were, what they did, what was their view of life. It was a very open-ended type of friendship that sort of, we created on the basis of just wanting to learn from one another. And one of my friends took me at some point to the Amazon in Ecuador, to the secondary forest. It was the very first time that I was seeing the Amazon for the first time. And I stayed there for a few days just observing essentially a number of different ceremonies that they were organizing, that they were, inviting people into, and listening to their way of talking and to their way of relating. I remember one moment, and it was specifically one moment, one morning, when I walked in the forest and I felt connected in a way that I never had before. And I'm not quite sure how to talk about it, right? Because it's a type of knowledge that is difficult to translate into words, especially into into a language that I'm more accustomed to using. I'm sort of more of an analytical person, as you may tell. And the experience is not very translatable in that sense. But I remember just kind of walking in the forest at some point and then sort of realizing actually that I was surrounded with forms of intelligence that went much beyond the human intelligence, that were intelligence, that communicated differently, and which held different forms of wisdom, which were much older than the type of wisdom that we have as a human species. And that was a turning point. I'm a kid who grew up, like, near Paris. I grew up on the agricultural belt of Paris, but I still consider myself as an urban kid, right? So to me, nature was essentially just something that you take fruits from, or food from in general, or that can make for a beautiful sight. But it was not an intelligent thing or form of being. It was not a connected form of being, and it was certainly not a connected form of being that I was connected to. That changed. When I was in the Amazon, it changed. I felt a form of humility that I don't think I've ever felt in any other circumstance. I've been humbled in many other ways, but that was a moment of complete reckoning and relatedness and understanding that I think just changes everything once you start having that piece of knowledge or intelligence within yourself. It changes you. Um, and I think in some ways, just the same way that I was talking about my grandparents being on the sort of recipient side of their experience, and in some ways channeling their experience, sort of maturing what they went through and sort of learning from them and sort of learning how to look at this sort of heritage in many different circumstances and how to sort of raise it or let it raise me essentially in a certain way, even though they're gone. To a certain extent, what happened in the Amazon is very much of the same vein. I was raised with this experience and I channel it. I have become essentially a sort of channel of a certain form of knowledge that I'm a part of. It does not belong to me, but it makes me connect to other forms of intelligence that make me more intelligent as a result, and wiser, at least a little bit, for it. And how does it change the way that, like, what does it teach me? Well, I it's a paradigmatic shift, right? Like, once you start looking at the world in that way, it changes you. And I'm still trying to understand how it changed me. And I'm also very conscious that this is or a knowledge or a form of wisdom and intelligence that needs to be nurtured. I'm not nurturing it in the way that it deserves to be nurtured, right? I've learned essentially that there are other ways of existing in the world, of being in the world, of relating to the world. And it's not that I took it, with me in the sense of extracting it from its place, right? It's still in me, but it kind of needs a system in which to grow.
Yeah.
Particularity, essentially, of the indigenous societies, right? They have their knowledge informs the way that they relate to one another, and the way that they relate to one another nurtures that knowledge and grows it over time, raises it over time as well. I don't have, like, it sort of informs a lot of my actions. It informs, I suppose, a lot of people, tell me you're very passionate. You're very present, right? I don't think that sure, like, maybe it's passion, but I think that it's more a question of just being present to that form of knowledge and trying to sort of channel it in that way and seeing what it does with me, and via me what it does, via my actions as well. And over time, hoping that it can also create the type of, systemic change that will eventually create the type of thing, the type of environment in which it can grow. But as I said, I'm just quite conscious of the fact that, well, to a certain extent, I never went back, right, like, to this experience. I tried, but it would require just nurturing it over time, keeping on learning from it, keeping on sort of plugging into it, and, nurturing the change in a different way. So for now, I have this piece of wisdom, I have this piece of information, this piece of intelligence inside of me. It keeps on doing its work, but I think it could grow and, hopefully sort of create many more ripple effects. And I think that there are more and more people sort of, coming to that kind of realization. I just, for now, I want to make sure not to idealize indigenous communities and their cultures. I want, for me, like the question that sort of gnaws at me a lot is, if we accept that the sort of Western societies, or
Industrial
something,
societies. Yeah.
right, sort of, got disconnected at some point from this form of knowledge, I don't understand why. I'm sure that there was a logic to it, because logic is a thing. It's just like it infuses a lot of how, like we function as a species. But it just
Yeah.
created some, path dependency that we have a lot of trouble getting out of. And I think that, the sense of, I also believe that we can't go back in the past. And in places like Europe, where I am today, I think that we can sort of learn differently, but I don't think that we can sort of, go back to something which is obviously sort of, of a more indigenous nature, also because, for that matter, we've lost a lot of the ecological sort of resilience that would nurture it right now. But I do believe in the possibility of indeed sort of looking at things differently and learning indeed from what other cultures have done differently and why they didn't go wrong the way that we did. And
Yeah. Yeah.
how to infuse
How
that
did
kind
they
of knowledge.
survive for thousands of years?
Exactly,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And how to respect nature in a completely different way, and how to work with nature. I think that this is one of the, at least for me, this is, at least today, this is what I sort of keep on working on. And as a message, this is the sort of key piece of intelligence that arises in me today. It's just like, we can work with nature. We don't need to extract from it, to the extent that we are doing it today. We can work with nature. We can regenerate it. We can still relate to it in a different way. And that's the part that I find enriching and incredibly, it's a beautiful challenge. It sounds very woo the way that I'm talking about it. It just doesn't, like resonate the way that I intended to, or the way that it sort of sounds within myself. But there is indeed, a completely different type of wisdom and path dependency that we can adopt once we start, making the changes. It doesn't mean that it's easy. It doesn't mean that it feels safe. And I think that this is also why a lot of people retract from it. But we don't really have the choice. Or if there is a choice, it's one between life and death. So I'm all for continuing life, including in its human form.
I think that is a beautiful place to close. My last question then for you, Olivia, is who would you like to platform or recommend comes on this podcast?
Well, I mean, if you haven't interviewed her already, I'd say Kate Rayworth. She's one of the most stunning human beings I've had the chance to meet in the recent past. And she is a source of inspiration because she has such a deep-rooted sense of integrity and alignment. And there is another woman that I admire also very profoundly. She's gonna, call me up at some point saying, "Why are you recommending me for all of these different podcasts?" But her name is Natalie Topa. She is a person who embodies the practice of complex regeneration and does it boots on the ground, not just conceptually. I'm essentially the kind of person who tries to sort of, tell the story of complex regeneration, who tries to bring it within complex dialogues and sort of conflict resolution and, within the international security outlook, right, in terms of conversation, politics, policy, and things like this. But she's boots on the ground. And she's done work in Yemen and Burundi and a lot of different places where she's worked with communities whose lives, entirely, well, can change as a result of the type of work that she does. We're going to need a lot more people like her very quickly. everywhere in order to sort of remember what it feels like to act with solidarity, to restore dignity, to remember what adaptation and resilience look like and what courage looks like. I think it's also a good way to sort of tie things back up to the beginning of the conversation. At the end of the day, these are the forces and inspiration essentially that we need to tap into for what's ahead, no matter what happens.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Olivia. This was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much, Nadia. And sorry that I made you cry. I really didn't intend to.
Quite all right. I cry a little bit every day, and I think it's a good thing. It keeps me connected, and it's important. It's important to cry. These things are difficult, and we have to keep processing, and we have to keep moving forward. If you liked the episode and want to hear more conversations where we explore how a more beautiful world might emerge, subscribe or follow on your favorite podcast app or the Entangled World Pod YouTube channel. If you loved it, support the project at patreon.com/Entangled World. Thank you for listening and for coming on this journey together.